Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? My part of this episode is going to be rather short because I have a great story coming to you at the end here from Michel, Reeser, nicknamed Beethoven, who, as most of you have heard me say before, when he was a young man, met most of the jazz greats and booked events and concerts and jazz festivals in Europe. He lives near Montreux in Lausanne, in Switzerland, in the French part of the country near Lake Geneva. Just a great guy. I mean, I love him dearly. He's an interesting fellow with great humanity and empathy for our fellow human man. And we connected very strongly on those lines. But also his stories of jazz come to me as unfiltered as they can be. Because these are all stories that he heard firsthand from the musicians themselves. Sweets Edison and Roy Brown being two of the primary guys he spent a lot of time with. But Gene Harris, I mean, it's a long list. He knew Bill Basie pretty well. He met Ella numerous times. But he knew, Al Gray. We've talked about so many guys and some were just people he met briefly. Others he spent time with in their homes. And many of them came to his home and his father's home, and they broke bread. The network for these musicians in Europe was probably sufficient, but it was also a small community on some ways in terms of lodging and going to fellowship with people. And so him and his father spent a lot of time with these jazz legends. So what that means is we're getting some great first-hand narratives, possibly second-hand, I guess, if you think about it. But first-hand in the fact that he was told directly from these people, but he wasn't there himself for a lot of these stories. But, and I said before, a lot of these stories have validated many of my feelings about the music, a lot of what it stood for, a lot of what it meant, a lot of how it was about overcoming and rejoicing in spite of sorrow. Let's have a good time. Life has enough sorrow. Last thing we need to do today is sit around and focus on that sorrow. And I saw that firsthand myself DJing in the black community. How much it's Friday night, we don't want to talk about racism. No. Are you kidding me? Let's talk about a good time, how we all made it here. None of our friends passed away this week. And it's always been kind of shocking to me how much more part of the everyday life the passing of loved ones is in the black community. And partly because so many younger participants in that community are extinguished at such a young age. I watched a thing recently about the black and white pre-civil rights atrocities, massacres. And it was something on YouTube, and it was, my wife couldn't even watch it. And Tulsa was number one, but boy, there was some stuff in Illinois and the Carolinas and Louisiana and Texas, Arkansas. I think they did 10 or 15 massacres. And some of the early ones on that list were 5, 6, 8 people, with some reports doubling those numbers. And some of the worst ones, there was 300-400 blacks murdered, slaughtered, and 1 or 2 black whites maybe lost their lives. And the inequality and the vengeance and the rage that comes from the wrong side of the fence. It's just hard to quantify sometimes. I'm like, you think that you were the ones that were in bondage for 4 centuries. And, we've talked about it before, the impotency of the white man. His sexual repression makes him feel emasculated by the potent black male. And so much of what we've heard about most of these accounts, it starts with a black man being accused of coming onto a white woman or attacking a white woman. But let's be clever in that language and understand what that's all was just being said, is that someone's white wife or girlfriend was talking to a brother. And sometimes I don't think it gets beyond, we're just talking. And could you imagine just talking to a white woman or a woman of an opposite race, color, and having that endanger your life? And the numbers in most of these massacres were thousands to hundreds in terms of the rage and the fucking mobs thousands of white people would show up to do these awful, awful things and burn neighborhoods and drop bombs from the sky in both Philadelphia and fire bombs in Tulsa, destroy black neighborhoods. Nothing drove the white man crazier, aside from them looking at our women, than when black men and women achieved any kind of affluence. And that was one of the common threads, is these were often black-led neighborhoods that were post, the abolition of slavery, and they were leading new black civic communities and becoming political leaders. In some instances, they'd actually gotten elected to Congress and to the state houses and represented these black neighborhoods that were becoming affluent. And that was untenable to the white man. And they burned and they destroyed these neighborhoods and businesses. And sometimes the National Guard would be called in and would put an end to things. But there's other incidences on this list of massacres where sometimes the police and the National Guard actually joined in. My soul was just sickened. And most of the stuff was happening in the 1915s, 1920s, 1930s, leading up towards civil rights in the 50s and 60s. And you can't disconnect that this is the world that Coleman Hawkins was coming into. Coleman Hawkins spent some time in Tulsa, from St. Joseph's, Missouri. Count Basie, Ellington. I mean, all the men that we've talked about in these Verve episodes recently. The Art Tatums, Sweets Edisons. Oscar Peterson, he's the anomaly in this. He was from Montreal, Canada. And while there was some racism in Canada and Montreal, it pales in comparison to the American experience. Thankfully. I mean, it's something I can say I'm proud of, is being Canadian and having to be less accountable for the actions of my forefathers. However, being of British and Dutch descent, I have plenty of guilt and weight on my global consciousness. Because golly, those two nations both did their share of atrocities. And you can't carry the load of your ancestors, but you still have to acknowledge it and feel some shame. You can't atone for it. I don't think even financial restitution is really necessarily a solution. Changing of the mind and the heart, I think, is what more minorities would appreciate. Why do you hate us so much? And fear and ignorance and the manipulation of the media all feeds that cycle of ugly hate and violence and destruction and pain and sorrow. And that pain and sorrow is what made this music happen. It's the fuel that burns that fire. And for anybody who finds the fuel of ego and virtuosity and innovation to be grander or greater than the fuel of I'm going to survive in spite of what the fuck you do to me, I don't know where you're coming from. Anybody who thinks that, oh, this technical proficiency is this so amazing, it stimulates my mind, that moves you more than the straight up blues gospel of, golly, let's throw down and have a good time because life is hard. And we're not going to be defeated. We are going to celebrate. That's far more motivating, edifying, feeds my soul. The music of the avant-garde era, the new jazz, new thing. I mean, there's some great stuff in there. And there's some stuff I go to and listen to at times still. A lot of it I don't feel much impulse to go back to at all. Little Freudian slip right there. Did you catch that? Much impulse to go back to at all. Wasn't planned. But the fuel of releasing my fear. The fuel of, I don't know how I'm going to get through the day. I don't know how I'm going to survive. The fear of, how do I not lose control of my anger? How do I not walk out in the streets and do crazy, awful things and end up dead myself because of what just happened to my cousin, my brother, my sister, my daughter, my father, my mother? How do I walk out into the world today and function and not lose my goddamn mind? I'm going to pick up my saxophone. Oh, it's sexually gratifying. It's spiritually quenching. It's the soul vanquishing the flesh's pain. And the Blue Note kids document that with that hard bop. But these Verve giants we've talked about these last few episodes, it's straight fire. It doesn't matter the content of the material, the bands that he assembles, Norman Granz, and the mindset and the state of things that were happening in America at that point. If you can't feel that gospel of survival, if you're missing that, you're not hearing it. You're not hearing jazz. I mean, I don't want to belabor the fucking point, but it's like I go on the Facebook pages, the jazz pages, and I just can't after 10 minutes, 15 minutes. It's the same 1,500 jazz records, the same limited scopes of comprehension and understanding and pressing talk and new releases, and you're missing the entire story. I know that's what this channel's here for, to try to fill that gap, to try to give comprehension and meaning to the music. But the stuff that became about ego and about innovation and about the competition of ego and the competition of virtuosity only can take place when certain standards of living, qualities of life measures are met. So by very virtue, some of that stuff that's technically proficient and compositionally challenging and interesting sound and moodscape, it just comes from a very, very different place than fuck, I'm just trying to survive. And they beat my nephew to death in Memphis this past weekend. How do I not go out and vanquish my enemy and take revenge? I mean, I think the controlling of that emotional fury is a hard thing to measure and a hard thing to quantify. Because when we feel rage, common sense goes out the window. That's why manslaughter charges exist. You can kill a motherfucker in a moment of rage. Common sense, it wasn't there. We acknowledge that. Less sentence for you. Yet the restraint that most of these men and women showed, incident after incident, day after day, running into swamps, hiding for their lives, fearing for their children. I just want that to be omnipresent in your thought and your feeling. And when you shop for jazz, remember the tyranny and sorrow that bred this art. The swing era was the black cat saying, man, y'all write some good melodies, but I can't fuck to it or dance to it. Let me remix that shit so now I can swing to some Gershwin. I mean, I like a lot of your little Broadway musicals. They're really nice, but I can't dance to it. Let me remix that for you. So all of a sudden now we out here with that melody but with that swing that you can fuck to. That's an incredible thing. That's an incredibly graceful, elegant, patient, comprehensive way to look at your pain in life, your sorrow, the resistance that you face, the enemy that is posed. Just to take his shit, his horns, his instruments, his songs, his music, his recording studios, and show him how it's done. Y'all never had a clue. That trumpet you had, you wasn't playing it. That saxophone you was marching to, that's not how that sounds. That organ, that bass, that drum, that piano, we got to show y'all how this is done in a way y'all never thought about being done before. And that's an incredible, cool thing to have had happen. And it just doesn't feel the same once we get into the mid to late 60s and 70s. It just doesn't. In part because the civil rights allowed the soul singers to now speak much of this message. It moves into the Curtis Mayfields and the Gil Scott Herons and the Isaac Hayes and the Stevie Wonders and the Marvin Gayes. These cats start singing Timmy Thomas. Why can't we get a love free friend? I mean, the war. These bands were talking now socially about this great flux. So jazz kind of lost that undercurrent, that resistance, that message. That was the voice was silenced, and it became more of an esoteric art form that was very much a one-to-one experience that didn't have the no longer playing for an amphitheater full of people dancing. It became we're on a stage having a fire session, and there's 12 hipsters and psychedelic monsters out in the crowd doing that whole thing to it, which is great. I mean, I love a Dead show. I love a hippie concert, jam band, let's do it. I like some psychedelic. I mean, no one did it better than the Beatles, though, sadly. But, so I just want to drive that point home. Jean-Michel, I'm going to pass the stage over to him, the microphone. He's got some great things to share with us about Oscar Peterson and Art Tatum, how those guys met, how they became friends. Thank you, Jean-Michel, for your participation. We much appreciate you. I love you, my brother. We'll talk to y'all soon. You have a great day. Peace. Sun coming right into that boom.
What about Norman Granz and Art Tatum and Oscar Peterson? Uh, Norman Granz, his favorite piano player was always Art Tatum. Um, he loved other piano players like Nat Cole, um, Teddy Wilson, Bud Powell, Count Basie a lot, and Duke Ellington, and some others. But his favorite piano player was Art Tatum, unless when he heard Oscar Peterson. I don't know if you heard the story. I think everybody knows that story, but I will tell the story again. Um, Oscar Peterson was in Montreal to promote some concerts for Artie's show in 1948, and he asked a cab to ask him to go back to the airport to take his very late plane at night, go back to New York, and he heard that trio on the radio, and he said to the guy, he said, "Which station is it?" And he said, "This is so and so and so." And he said, "Oh, because what is played there is fantastic, you know." And he said, "Do you know a record store, an album?" And he said, "No, it's not an album, it's live." And he said, "Live?" He said, "Yeah, right now, live." So he said, "Do you know where the club is?" He said, "Yeah." So he turned around and went immediately to the club, and he presented to him, and he asked Oscar Peterson to come to New York and to be part as a new talent at the Jazz at the Philharmonic. And during those days, Oscar Peterson said no. Can you believe it? Saying no to Norman Granz. Norman Granz hated that. If there is one word that he hated in his life, that was the word no. So he said, "No, I am not ready yet." So after a few months, Norman called again Oscar Peterson, and he said, "Listen, look, I have an idea. In a couple of months, maybe in 1949, I will present my new show at the Carnegie Hall, and I want you to be there as a special guest, just to play a couple of tunes. So the idea is you go to the audience, and I will call you from the audience. You go up and you play a couple of songs." And Oscar Peterson say, "Okay, I'm gonna do it." And but he said, "I want to play." Oscar Peterson wanted to play. Norman Granz wanted to ask Oscar Peterson to play. I want you to play solo. And he said, "No, Norman, look at it." You know, he said, "I'm not a solo pianist. I'm a trio piano player. So I want to play with the trio." And he said, "Okay, you're gonna have Ray Brown and Buddy Rich." So he said, "Oh, perfect. By the way, Ray Brown and Oscar met before. They met in a train, um, Ray Brown took a train from Montreal back to New York. And in the same place, there was this young pianist who was visiting some friends in New York, and it was Oscar Peterson. That's how they met. They met by accident in a train, you know. So anyway, so at the concert, the first part was the show with the horns, and Buddy Rich, man, he took everything down. He played so great, so he was very exhausted. When Norman asked Oscar to come on stage, Buddy Rich said, "No, I'm exhausted. I have to have some rest for about 15 or 20 minutes." So he began to have a duo. So it was Ray Brown and Oscar Peterson duo, the famous Tenderly, and everybody was screaming, you know. After the show, um, Oscar Peterson was staying at Count Basie because Count Basie already knew Oscar Peterson and he already loved him, you know. So he said, okay, he said, Oscar, you come a couple of days so you can stay at my home. So he stayed at his home. And Bill Basie told me that story. He said, that Oscar Peterson, listen what he did. So he always asked Count Basie where Art Tatum is playing and which club and so on and so on. And during the days that Oscar Peterson was at Count Basie, Art Tatum didn't play anywhere. But finally, for some, can't remember, but for some reasons, he found the hotel where Art Tatum stayed at. Art Tatum stayed always in hotels. He never had an apartment in New York. He always stayed at hotels. So can you believe it or not? There is this story that Bill Basie told me. He said, can you believe it? That Oscar Peterson, man, one morning at 7 o'clock, he knocked at his door. And he said, if there is one thing you can't do with Art Tatum is knocking at his door in very early in the morning, because everybody knew that Art Tatum loved so much to play that after the shows that he did on clubs, after close at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, very early in the morning, then he went jam. So after that, he was jamming with some other people. And most of the time, as Bill Basie told me, he said he came back home at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. So he said, if there is one thing not to do is to knock at his door at this time. And he did it. And he knocked at his door and he said, Mr. Art Tatum, I am Oscar Peterson. I am a piano player from Canada. I love you. I love your playing. And I want to meet you. I want to have some lessons. And Art Tatum was so astonished about that he said, okay. He let him go to his room, and that's how they first met and became very great friends. And everybody knew, and we knew that Art Tatum, he said, after a few bars, he said to himself, oh, that guy, he's a prodigy. This guy, nobody can play the piano that this guy plays. So many years went by, I think it was just before Art Tatum died. They had a special concert in Los Angeles, and Art Tatum was there, and Oscar Peterson was there, and Count Basie was there. And for some reasons, Art Tatum said to Basie, said, "Can you believe it? This guy knocked at my door at 7 o'clock one morning." And he said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." And we knew that was when Oscar was at Basie's home, and Basie said, "You some guy, Peterson, go out, okay, with love." But Bill Basie told me, he said, "Can you believe it? He never told me that he did it when he was at my home. You know, I think that was a nice story to tell about that. So when Oscar Peterson came up, of course, as we know now, uh, the really next favorite pianist of Norman Granz was Oscar, of course. Even if he produced later on many other players, you know, we forget to name another great pianist in the 50s and the 60s. His business was not that great. Was Teddy Wilson. He was one of the greatest jazz pianists from the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. And Norman Granz decided to record him as much as he could because nobody wanted to listen to Teddy Wilson anymore. Like with Art Tatum, you know, when Bud Powell, who revered a lot, you know, musicians, all kind of style, they still revere on Art Tatum. The problem were the critics and the fans, you know. When bebop came along, you know, that was the that was it. That was the style. That was the thing to play. So everybody put aside Art Tatum, you know, and Norman Granz couldn't support that. He said, no, it's not fair. It can't be do like that, you know. So that's why when Art Tatum decided to leave New York because he couldn't get that much jobs, he went West Coast, where he had a lot of very well, good paid jobs. He had a lot of friends in Hollywood. Norman Granz decided to record as much as he could Norman Granz, and today I think he put out about 50 albums, 50 CDs of Art Tatum. And I remember that was in Montreux 1977. I was there with my parents, and there was a lot of people, you know, there. And Norman Granz was there, and there was a critic. And we were just sitting there with my parents, and the critic said, why did you record so much album with Art Tatum? Who cares about Art Tatum? Man, we thought that Norman Granz wouldn't care that critic. Oh man, he was very rude with him, but he was right. And he said sooner or later, maybe I will not be there to see it, but I'm sure that sooner or later people they will revere me, will tell me thank you very much to have recorded all those stuff that I did with Art Tatum.